Hi, everybody. My name is Evan Shapiro. I'm co-chair. I'm actually chair of One Day Immersion and co-founder of One Day Immersion with Dolly. Thanks for coming today. You're going to have a great program. As you know, our theme today is one diverse industry. Our mission here is to create meaningful connections between existing leaders and executives in the media industry and a diverse pool of great young talent from around the world, frankly. And this panel is kind of the epitome of what we're going to do today. We've got an amazing leader talking to four really great students from the New York area. So without further ado, I'm going to tee up the panel. It is meant to be a panel. I'm going to throw it to our speaker for a few comments and then around the horn for some questions. First of all, I want to thank our students, Ambar Castillo from CUNY, Brian Garrett from Medgar College, Jennifer Zaurov from Pace University, and Deets Sharma from NYU. And now I want to introduce you to somebody who is really just one of those rare birds in the media and entertainment industry, somebody who's incredibly talented and smart and visionary, but also considered one of the nicest and most generous people in the industry. It's an odd mix, I know. George Cheeks is the president and CEO of CBS Entertainment Group. He has oversight of a tremendous amount of operations over at CBS. He's also behind the enormous commitment that CBS made to representation, equal and inclusive representation in front of the camera, behind the camera, and in the writer's room, something that needs a lot of attention. Before that, he was vice chairman of NBC Studios and Late Night. He's worn a lot of hats, from legal to programming to operations and across the gamut. He's also kicked in quite a few doors. So I really want to thank our guest for donating his time and his thoughts and his vision today. Without further ado, Mr. George Cheeks.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks very much. Hey, everybody. I'm very excited to be here today. Thanks to Ambar, Brian, Jennifer, and Deets for participating. You know, when Evan asked me to do this, I took a little time to inform myself about ODI and its mission and its impact, and I immediately wanted to be part of this. And then to be part of this theme of one diverse industry made me even more excited to participate. Because for me, you know, I took over CBS about 1 week into the pandemic. And, you know, very shortly after that, as we all know, we went through a very painful justice reckoning in the wake of the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And, you know, I had seen moments in our history before where really impactful things had happened. And there was a lot of sort of performative reaction at a lot of these media companies, but not real substantive change. And, you know, and I know we're going to talk about this more as we get into the Q&A, but what was really important to me was to create a system where there was purpose and intention and accountability around the changes we need to make to truly be one diverse industry. So with that as a tee up, I'm going to open it up to the Q&A and let's get started.
Great. Jennifer, you actually volunteered to go first, so I'm going to toss it to you first.
Yes, sounds good. I'm so happy for today's conference. And thank you so much, George, for being here. So my question is, before your transition into Viacom CBS, you worked at NBC Universal. What did you learn from your tenure at NBCU, and how do those experiences influence your role as a CBS executive?
It's an interesting question. So I mean, Evan can relate to this. I learned a lot in that experience. I think, you know, working at a traditional legacy company can be very challenging as you're going through a transformative period, whether it's, you know, due to ecosystem changes because audience consumption patterns are changing, but also around culture too. So one of the key sort of overarching things I learned was how to navigate, you know, a legacy system and how to really be a foment for change, recognizing that change happens a little more slowly than you might like at big companies. But it's a challenge, but it actually is very gratifying when you sort of start to understand how the company operates and where you can bring about change. So I think that was probably one of the biggest learnings I had because, you know, as I grew and evolved in the organization, as Evan said before, I went from an operational role into a role that was sort of hybrid creative business into, you know, running a studio and a network. So the role changed, and as it evolved and I had more responsibility, those skills I learned around navigating these legacy systems became more and more helpful.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, understanding the systems in which you work is part of the way you change them, I guess, right? Brian, did you have a question?
Yes, absolutely. So, being a part of a generation where technology has kind of engulfed our lives, I want to know, what role do you feel media and television has on not only the American public, but the world?
Well, I think it has a critical role. I mean, I think we can change minds. We can, a lot of people's experiences, initial experiences from things they don't understand come through the media. So I feel a tremendous sense of that responsibility. And I'll just talk specifically about CBS. I mean, when I sit down with my programming team, what I tell them all the time is the win for us is to find shows that appeal to that core CBS audience, but actually broaden the aperture. And the way you do that is you bring more underrepresented voices as creators, as writers, as actors in front of the camera. And so that's how you make change. So I mean, just to give one example here, we launched last year a new version of Equalizer starring Queen Latifah, and there was strong, diverse representation in the writers' room, a clear point of view in the lead character. It was the #1 show last year. It's extremely strong this year, and it plays into exactly what I said, Brian, which is there's a show that appealed to that core CBS audience, but it brought in an audience that wasn't even watching CBS before. And that's the win. That's why what I would also reinforce here is that I'm constantly telling the team and reinforcing the business case for true diversity and inclusion. Because again, when you're a media company, you're serving your audience. And if you're underserving any part of your audience, you're not doing your job.
Yeah, I mean, having those diverse voices in the decision-making room, you're diverse, you come from a diverse background. That is really meaningful. That's how you get these conversations to take hold a little bit more than just surface, I think. Ambar, did you have a question?
I do. I was wondering, with your background in entertainment law, what entertainment law taught you about how to manage other aspects of the business?
That's a great question. So I went to law school because that's what my parents thought I should do. But I mean, I was so convinced I wanted to work in entertainment that actually between my second and third year of law school, I worked in casting. I was a casting associate out in Los Angeles, and I had candidly no intention of ever being a lawyer. So I went back, I finished law school. I told my parents that I was just going to go right into entertainment. And, you can imagine the guilt trip that I got from day one. I, of course, capitulated. And I said the compromise was I went into entertainment law. So I went in a little bit kicking and screaming, Ambar, to tell you the truth. But the reality is that I actually learned so much foundationally about the business, because when you're a lawyer in that space, in order to give advice and counsel, you really have to understand all aspects. You've got to understand the creative process. You got to understand the business. You got to understand how it's changing and evolving. So in the end, as much as I resisted, I actually think it made me a better executive to have that foundation.
I've worked with a lot of people who kind of went through that same experience you did, which is they went to law school and then never really got into the practicing of law all that much, and then wound up, in like you, finding new careers. They tend to be real. Like I think alongside business school, law school teaches you kind of how to solve problems in interesting ways. So it's an interesting path to go, even if you're not necessarily want to practice, right?
It's problem solving and it's analytical. It's both of those things. Like right. It really does teach you how to do and persuasion. When you're a lawyer, you've got to advocate for your client or whatever. And that there's a lot of advocacy based in this business and things we have to do.
Yeah. Deets?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for doing this, George. My question is, it's kind of a good piggyback off Brian's question, I'm realizing, and it requires kind of a preface. So I think we're like kind of living through a time when people are asking for, I guess like the business of business to not just be business. Like they're looking for business leaders to kind of lead social change, which I guess is thematically appropriate given the theme of this conversation. Things like ESG are a really big deal, diversity, inclusion, stuff like that. And so my question is a two-parter. For you as somebody who leads an organization, what would you say is your highest corporate value? What is your highest value as somebody who leads a company? And part B is, how are you operationalizing that value through the work that you're doing at CBS? if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. So I think the way I would step back from this for a second is I believe that as you evolve as a leader, you have to have sort of fundamental leadership pillars that guide everything you do. So as I started to evolve and grow in my career, I spent a lot of time thinking about what are sort of those core principles, competencies that I think are going to be important for me to succeed as a leader. So just laying those out really quickly. For me, it's transparency, it's accessibility, it's communication, it's openness to new ideas, and it's true diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, on the first four, I spend a lot of time, being mindful of how I present myself every day in every interaction I have, whether it's problems or whatever it is, try to make sure that I'm living those principles. On the diversity, equity, and inclusion front, and Evan alluded to this before, I think the challenge there is, number one, we're looking at a system that has been systemically biased for a very long time. So change doesn't come overnight. And I think that's part of the reason why there have been fits and starts in this space. So what I've tried really hard to do with my team is to start to lay out intentional targets and intentional plans to continue to move us forward, but to support them through accountability and to also remind people who are, frustrated by the slow pace of change that this is a marathon, that like, if we really want to effectuate true meaningful change, it's a process. Now, the other thing I'd go back to something else that Evan said, it's also multifaceted, because what you sometimes find happening in media business is it becomes very reactive, and you hear folks saying, where is representation? And then all of a sudden you see a few more people of color on screen, but you still don't have people behind the camera who are representative. So the stories that are being told through a filter of folks who don't really share those experiences. Or also, as Evan said, you've got leadership that is not representative. And so therefore they're not necessarily, there's implicit bias in all of us. Now, as a biracial, openly gay man, when I got this job, I felt very much like this is a moment for me to own who I am and to, be my full authentic self at work and allow that to guide me as I do the work and work with the team to do the work we need to do to build this out. So just to give you a few examples, because again, in order to be intentional about this work, you have to be really targeted about this work. So first, on the executive side, what I did very early on is I sat down with the senior leadership team and I said, as you will see in many companies, you see growth in inclusion at the very junior levels, but you see it taper off more and more as you get to more senior levels. So what I tried to explain to the team is that, first of all, what true inclusion, what this process really means is taking a step back on what it means to hire the best people for these jobs. How wide a net are you casting? Are you just going back to the same folks who've gotten the jobs over and over again, keep recycling into the same jobs? So out of that, I mandated what we call diverse slates. So particularly for senior jobs, I've said, I want you to present to me your slate of candidates. That slate has to reflect our environment, which is it has to be diverse. It has to, from a gender standpoint, from a race standpoint, it has to reflect the society we live in. And then if you do that, you choose the best person for the job, as long as the criteria for best has been challenged. And as long as we understand what it truly means to be the best person for that job. So that's on the executive side. And then on the creator side, or on the, the creation, the content side, as Evan mentioned before, I set out a target for 40% BIPOC representation of our writers' rooms. And I won't lie, there was some resistance initially, but after some subtle pressure, we got to 43% of our writers identify as BIPOC for this current season. 17 of our 21 writers' rooms either met or exceeded that baseline. And then I have set a mandate of 50% for next season. So again, these are targets and we may not hit all of them, but the intentionality of pushing us in the right direction. We did something similar on the casting side. We've made tremendous progress on the casting side. reality in particular, where CBS was getting a lot of pushback and blowback around a lack of inclusion in reality casts, we reached 57% BIPOC representation on shows like Survivor and Big Brother. And again, it shows you sort of how you move the needle when you push targets and you really sort of remind folks that like all you're doing is reflecting the audience that's watching your shows. And the proof is in the ratings, because in all cases in these shows, we're actually seeing ratings upticks, whether it's on the linear side or even more so on the delayed viewing and on-demand side. And then the last thing, and I'll stop talking, I'm sorry, but on the, because I also want to hit the point how important it is that great to have writers representation, great to have, actors in front of the camera representation, but you've also got to amplify the voice, the creator voices of color. And so that was one of the reasons why we pulled together this NAACP partnership between CBS Studios and the NAACP, which is its sole focus is to help bring writers of color through the system, help find the right home for projects, and just make sure that we're giving the support that's needed to sort of guide through this creative process. So there's more examples of this, but this is the kind of work you need to do and continue to do in order to build towards one diverse industry.
Yeah, the peaks and valleys of diversity and inclusion in the industry stem from the fact that they become initiatives and not systems. And those are different. Initiative is like, hey, let's make ourselves feel better. What George is talking about is baking in. People use the dirty word of quota to get people to back off of this. But what it is performance metrics, just like audience or earnings or any other metric you will put in your executive team, right?
Exactly. It's funny you say that, because at the end of the day, this truly is not about quotas. This truly is about let's really think about what it really means to be the best at what somebody does. But Mark Morial, who runs the National Urban League, I did a panel with him recently. He said something that just stuck with me. He said, whenever anybody says the quota word, he said, you know what? You're right. I am fighting a quota. I'm fighting a quota that was 100% representative of straight white men. That's the quota that I'm fighting against. I'm not building a quota. I'm fighting against the quota. I just thought that was a very powerful way to.
Well, and those words like pipeline and quota, those are the things that stop progress. And when you turn them into performance metrics, that's when you're going to get resistance. But that's the moment you're stepping on the right panel. We have to build these as systems, not just initiatives when we feel pressure. Jennifer, I know you had a bunch of questions, so I'm going to go back to you.
Yes, I have a bunch of questions. First of all, I'm loving the conversation we're having. That's so interesting with quotas and how everything's transitioning and how we can go up with executive levels to see how things can get changed from the bottom up, from the top down. So I have a question pivoting a little bit to Paramount Plus. And one of the answers could be with having a more diverse audience and having that. So with so many new streaming platforms, it seems as though the landscape is very saturated. So what are the goals of Paramount Plus to stand out and combat this?
Yeah, there's no question that there is obviously, a ton of competition in the streaming space. I mean, I would say two things. One is the principles around Paramount Plus is sort of a broad pay service leaning into three core pillars, which is entertainment, news, because of the strength of CBS News, and live sports. And in the live sports space, in addition to having the core leagues that exist on CBS, really doubling down and leaning into soccer, which is proving to be a huge subscription driver, is bringing in a younger audience, is bringing in a more diverse audience. So it's kind of leaning into that. But in terms of sort of overall streaming strategy, the Viacom CBS strategy is slightly different in that basically there are three core streaming pillars. One is broad pay, which I would put Paramount Plus in that category. One is more premium pay, which is sort of the Showtime OTT experience. And one is what we call FAST, or free ad-supported television, which is Pluto. And so what we're basically trying to do is create this sort of linked ecosystem of these differentiated offerings and try to figure out ways, for example, we have channels on Pluto that drive, content around Star Trek and Star Trek Discovery with the goal of upselling you into the Paramount Plus experience, where there are the two tiers. There's the limited ad tier the essentials tier, which is slightly cheaper, and then the ad-free tier, which is slightly more expensive. So it's a very challenging streaming marketplace, but I think where we're really finding our kind of swing and headwind, and tailwind, is in leaning into kids, because we have a lot of these Nickelodeon brand kid content, which has been great, and leaning into a lot of our core franchises, and in really sort of figuring out, what's the way to really sort of build and develop our core franchises in a meaningful way. So another example would be on the cable side, the show Yellowstone, which proved to be a huge success. We did a big deal with Taylor Sheridan, and we're creating sort of an entire sort of Yellowstone ecosystem on Paramount Plus with prequels and sequels. And, again, trying to sort of lean into experiences that we've now seen really work for both a linear audience and a streaming audience.
Has it been really difficult to change the mindset from kind of a wholesale mentality you're selling to cable operators and satellite players to one that is more a retail direct to consumer?
As you know very well, it is a huge challenge because, again, the wholesale business is still a high margin business. Obviously subscribers are declining and all of that. That's undeniable, but it's still, a very important core part of all of these businesses, of the Disney business, of the Warner Discovery business, all these businesses. So kind of navigating that and toggling between building your streaming business and managing a legacy declining but still meaningful business is a very big challenge. I would say what's really impressed me about this company is that there are people at the company who are really charged with really keeping their eye 100% on the streaming side. There are, legacy distribution people really focused on the legacy business. And then people like myself and Brian Robbins and Chris McCarthy who recognize that we're managing both. And so for me, CBS, even in a declining marketplace, is still a huge reach vehicle. In order to sometimes inspire my team, I constantly remind them that if you take some of the Netflix metrics on views and you take some of their biggest titles out there, a traditional Tuesday on CBS blows them away. So I really do, I am still a believer in that broadcast platform, but I also recognize the audience shifts. And what for me, my high five moments are when there are shows that on CBS, like the NCISs, the Criminal Minds, et cetera, of the world, can find 7, 8, 9, 10 million viewers in that night, but then can double or even triple that audience in delayed viewing. And usually that audience is about 20 to 30 years younger than the audience on CBS. So then you're talking about reach that looks like it did 10, 15 years ago before everybody was talking about the decline of traditional television.
Yeah, I look at FAST as a version of broadcast television, kind of in digital. Deets, did you have something to add to that? You raised your hand, like it's school and stuff.
Yes, this is like a related question. Somebody asked about technology already. It kind of feels like with streaming, there's like two directions. There's like media that's like moving into technology, and there's technology that's moving into media, whereas like there's legacy media where all it did was media and now they're streaming. And then there's like technology companies where their like media offering is part of the flywheel. That's our favorite word, the flywheel of the whole company. And so I'm wondering, like, broadly speaking, what do you think is the strategy for success there? Like, is it about just having the best content, like have the show that everyone wants to watch? Or is it more about like, how do you hire people who can build platforms that can position content and recommend stuff? And that's a little more like kind of tech focused. Like, what, as somebody who's going in this direction from media into technology, how do you think about that?
So I genuinely, and I hope this doesn't seem like a cop-out, I genuinely think it's all of the above. And I think what's interesting to me is that, and you kind of hit on it in the question, what I see as an observer is that the tech companies that are getting into the media space are struggling because they're trying to apply all the sort of paradigms of tech to content production. Whereas on the other flip side, the people who know how to create great content that resonates and people want to watch are less good at the product side, the tech side, the UI side, et cetera. And so one of the greatest challenges for both sides is trying to figure out how to bring those disparate cultures together to optimize the experience and to optimize the content. And so I think, again, sometimes when folks at the company get frustrated with the fact that we feel too legacy or whatever, I remind people that on any side, you could work at Viacom, CBS, Disney, you could work at Apple, you could work at any place. You're going to find those frustrations. They're going to be balanced one way or the other, depending on whether it's starting from a tech focus or starting from more traditional content focus. But it's pivotal, Deets, and I think that's where you win. Where you win is where you find that synergy between the two.
Agreed. I think Netflix's success isn't necessarily centered around a show. It's that integration.
Correct.
Brian. Loving your artwork, by the way.
Thank you. Got to give a little credit to my mother. Yes. So, excuse me. So yeah, I definitely kind of wanted to get more into George Cheeks, the guy, and just kind of understand you more intricately. After hearing that, you didn't necessarily want to go into law, and you were kind of forced. I just want to know. I'll kind of adjust my question. What do you feel jump-started your passion as it pertains to executive work within television? And how do you feel, what do you feel as it has been your most challenging moment thus far?
So I would say I knew I wanted to be in entertainment since a very young age. I was actually a child actor when I was younger, and I really did initially think that I wanted to be an actor. And then I went to college, and one of my closest friends, who she might be ahead of your time, but I went to college. I grew up with a woman named Molly Shannon who used to be on SNL. And the plan was that we were going to move to New York and toil away and find a small little apartment and try to get cast. And so graduated from college, and she was all ready to go. And I'm like, I don't think I can do that. So I don't think I have that passion. So that's why, I went to law school and I went that whole route. But I knew all along that I wanted to be entertainment, which is why I said before, even, feeling the pressure to become a lawyer, the compromise was I'll be a lawyer, but it's got to be in the entertainment space. So to the second part of your question, I think the hardest thing for me, which I knew was going to be hard, and it took a while to get there, was that I knew I didn't want to not only just be on the legal side, I knew I didn't want to just be on the business side. I knew that I had, real passion for the creative process. And I knew that I had, I understood that this was a creative business. And I always believed that people who have an understanding of the creative process, but also can appreciate the business side, actually could be most optimal in this business. And I think that's true now more than ever, given the accelerated pace of change. So for me, the biggest challenge was being able to transition into a role that basically straddled business and creative. And sort of the inflection moment for me, ironically, given the fact that Molly Shannon went on to be on SNL, the transition moment for me was when Lorne Michaels decided he wanted me to run late night for NBC, because that was my very first job that actually had a creative component and a business component. But there were no guarantees that I was ever going to get there, and that was by far the greatest challenge, was figuring out how to be taken seriously. Now, I will say, since we're talking to students, one of the best pieces of advice a mentor gave me is she said to me, don't give up on that dream, but recognize that everything takes work. So in the entire time that I was at Viacom the first time, where I was the lawyer, I befriended some of the people on the creative side, and I said, look, let me read scripts, let me look at cuts of reality shows and give you my notes, and then critique me. Let me know what I got right, let me know what I got wrong. So I added a whole other job to my day job, because I did believe that these are skill sets that people cultivate over years and years. And I knew that I had to put the work in order to validate and justify why I believed that I could do both.
Yeah, I mean, it's to take on a self-education in notes giving while you're running legal for a department at Viacom it's an interesting choice, George. But it's obviously paid off, and that's the kind of work ethic I think people don't understand that it takes to really, interlope from department to department. It's difficult to make those moves. Corporations like to put people into boxes. And so to move from one to one, you really have to want it, and you have to demonstrate that need, that want. Ambar, we have limited time, so I'm not going to say this is the last question, but it may be. depending on how long George's answer is.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, no pressure. Yeah, so with some of these changes you touched on in the media ecosphere, it makes me think of shifts even in elements we typically think of as like this unchanging core, like media law and ethics. So, as someone schooled in media law, I'm wondering what some of the biggest mistakes you've seen people make in media law and ethics. Yeah.
So I guess the first one I would mention, and this is for all lawyers out there in every industry, I think when you're giving advice and counsel, I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make is to solely focus on the four corners of whatever the law is that you are, opining on, and not looking at the ethical implications. So, because there are many things that you can do that are within the boundaries of the law, but are not necessarily the right ethical choices. And what I would add to that in the media space, Ambar in particular, is that people sometimes forget the tremendous microscope that the media business finds itself in. And I can think of countless examples of PR disasters that weren't necessarily law violations, but if a media lawyer had leaned in and said, look, from a legal standpoint, you can do X, Y, and Z, but here's why I'm concerned about it. And at a minimum, let's bring the PR team in to discuss the implications of this, because if you think for 1 second this is going to happen under the radar, you're crazy. So I think those two things are, the first point is sort of true of everything, but I think in media especially, I think it's important to consider the PR implications of any kind of sort of ethical breach.
Especially right now. George, that is our time. Any parting shots, last thoughts for this collective and then who they represent out in our audience?
Yeah, I guess the last thing I would say is, one of the things that I think has really helped me through my career, and I would recommend to all of you, regardless of what careers you're choosing, is really looking for, guidance and mentorship. And mentor is not a singular word. I mean, mentor, there will be aspects of your career, your leadership, all the things that you can pull from different folks. I mean, I truly believe that mentorship does take a village. And so I would say just always be open and, and recognize that you won't necessarily agree with all the advice and counsel that you're given, but always take the time to process it and understand where it comes from and ask questions. But I think all of that will really help lead you in whatever direction you want to go and whatever career choice you're making.
Well, that's great advice, and I think your career is kind of an example of that. And I really thank you so much for kicking this day off. It was a perfect way to start this off. All five of you all were great. The questions were amazing from the students. George, thank you so much for the generosity of your time and your thoughts. Congrats on everything, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.